Okay, good evening, everybody. It's Wednesday night, which means Halacha and Tanya. The Halacha that we were learning recently, the last number of weeks, is the Dinim of Muktzeh. Okay, today we're going to also discuss, I just want to make one correction of something that we learned a while ago, just to clarify it. We discussed that something which is Muktzeh, when Shabbos begins, remains Muktzeh for the entire Shabbos. Okay, it's called Migai. Since it's Muktzeh when Shabbos began, it's Muktzeh for the entire Shabbos. So we were discussing then if clothes are wet, you wash clothing and they're wet. So what happens if when Shabbos began, the clothes are in the dryer, let's say, and they're not dry yet. But they're going to be dry because the dryer is on. Or you hung them on the clothesline before Shabbos, and in the course of a few hours, they're going to be dry. So then, we said then it's really Muktzeh, which is not so simple. Most people say that because you knew it was going to become dry, barring something unforeseen, but the stuff is in the dryer when Shabbos began, and therefore you know for sure it's going to become dry, or you hung them up on the clothesline before Shabbos, and you knew they were going to be dry, so then the clothes are not Muktzeh. When would the clothes be Muktzeh? If you let them wet in a pile, and they were wet when Shabbos began, you're not planning to hang them up, and therefore they were wet and not usable when Shabbos began, so then they remain Muktzeh for the entire Shabbos. But there is another issue that Poskin, which is a din in Shulchan Aruch, which is relevant to dryers and dishwashers and all that. And that is, there's something called, in halacha, it's called afshe milsa. Afshe milsa means it doesn't look right for Shabbos. In the din in Shulchan Aruch, actually, what the Gemara talks about in the time of Shulchan Aruch, it talks about that if somebody has a grinding mill, grinding mills would make a lot of noise. So they would put it on before Shabbos, let's say, start running it before Shabbos, and it would continue working during Shabbos. So even though you put it on before Shabbos, it says in Shulchan Aruch and in the Gemara that you're not allowed to do that before Shabbos. Why? Because to have a machine working in the house that makes noise is not in the spirit of Shabbos. So therefore, the poskim write the same thing with the dryer, with the dishwasher. Let's say the dishwasher goes on Shabbos on a timer, or the dryer is started before Shabbos, or the dishwasher started before Shabbos and it's washing and drying the dishes on Shabbos. So again, even though as far as the halachos of Shabbos, you're not desecrating Shabbos because you did it before Shabbos began, nevertheless, it is not what's called afshe milsa. It's not in the spirit of Shabbos. So therefore, you can't have a dryer running from before Shabbos into Shabbos. You can have a dishwasher running and things like that. Okay, now let's discuss a general aspect of Muktzeh. Now we learned that Muktzeh means the various reasons why the Chachamim instituted the prohibition of Muktzeh. Either because you might come to carry something, or because you might come to do something forbidden, or because people that didn't work a whole week, how was Shabbos, unique for them, or if the Torah says you can't walk on Shabbos, talk on Shabbos, they can do during the week, so how much more so moving things and touching things like that. So we learned at the beginning, we're discussing that you cannot move Muktzeh in the regular way of moving Muktzeh. You can't pick up money, which is completely Muktzeh, and move it. If it's a keli shemalachta le'isser, meaning a vessel whose primary use is for something forbidden on Shabbos, like a pen. So then if I need the place or I need to use the pen for something permissible on Shabbos, I will be allowed to move it. But what happens if something is really Muktzeh? Am I allowed to indirectly kick it? Can I use it to move it with my elbow or so on and so forth? So, let's discuss. It's called tilta kalachayad. It's called tilta minatzad, or another indirect moving of Muktzeh. So let's say So the din is like this: indirect muktzeh, when I'm not actually touching the muktzeh itself. I'm not touching, I'm indirectly moving the muktzeh. I'm taking a book to move something which is muktzeh. So I'm moving the muktzeh with my hands, but I'm not doing it directly with my hands. I'm doing it indirectly with my hands. So then the din is as follows. These are very practical din because sometimes you want to move muktzeh, you want to get it out of the way. How would you be allowed to do it? So the din is like this. If I'm moving it for the purpose of the muktzeh, that's why I'm indirectly moving the muktzeh. Because it's for the purpose of the muktzeh, and I'll give you examples in a second, then you wouldn't be allowed to. But if I'm not doing it because of the muktzeh, I'm doing it because of something permissible, then I would be allowed to move it indirectly. I'll give you a simple example of muktzeh. There's muktzeh on a chair. Okay, now, there's another din called buses that we're not getting into. But let's say I have, you know what, let's make it simple. There's a table, not a very big table. The candles were lit on the table, okay? And I put the challah on the table. So therefore the table is not a base only for muktzeh. I'm allowed to move the table after the candles go out, okay? So now the question is like this, the candles go out. Can I pick up the table? Because indirectly with my hands, I'm moving the muktzeh. So would I be allowed to pick up the table? Because again, I'm not picking up the muktzeh with my hand and moving it. That's for sure you can't do. But I'm not directly moving the muktzeh. I'm indirectly moving the muktzeh through something which is not muktzeh. I'm picking up the table. The table is not muktzeh because there was challah on the table. And now I'm indirectly moving the muktzeh. Or a chair. Let's say that I would be allowed to move that has money on it. Would I be allowed to move the chair because then I'm only doing it indirectly? So the din is like this. If I'm doing it, not for the muktzeh, I need the place where the chair is. I need the place where the chair is. So then I'm not doing it for the money. I'm not moving it because of the money. I need the place where the chair is on, or I need the chair in a different room. Then, if it's not a base of muktzeh, I would be allowed to pick up the chair, indirectly moving the muktzeh and taking out of the room. If I'm doing it because I want to protect the money, I don't want people to steal it. I don't want whatever it is, and I'm picking it up indirectly to move the money into the other room because I want to protect the money or the usage of the money, then I wouldn't be allowed to do it. Because then I'm moving it indirectly, but it's for the sake of the muktzeh itself. And again, let's give an example of the table. Okay, let's say it's not a big dining room table. Okay, it's a folding table. And I was eating on the folding table before Shabbos began. I put challah on the table, the candle, everything's on the table. It's Shabbos morning, the candles are out. I need to move the table. I need to move the table. So now the question is like this. Am I allowed to indirectly move the candle holders, which is muktzeh? But I'm not picking up the candle holders and moving it. I'm moving the table. Indirectly, the candle holder is moving. So if I need the table in another room, or I need the space that the table is on, so I'm not moving the muktzeh indirectly for the benefit of the muktzeh. I'm moving it because for the benefit of the non-muktzeh object. So then I would be allowed to do it. If I'm moving it for the muktzeh thing itself, I wouldn't be allowed to do it. Or give you a number of other practical examples. What happens, we were discussing previous times that raw meat and raw fish is muktzeh on Shabbos because they're not edible. In America, meanwhile, we don't eat raw meat so much and raw fish at the present. So it's actually muktzeh. It's raw. Yom Tov, it's not muktzeh, we learned, because you could cook it. So therefore, it's edible on Yom Tov, so it's not muktzeh. What happens if I have the ice cream in the back of the freezer, and now I have in front of it, I have raw meat or raw fish, which is muktzeh. Am I allowed to take, so we discussed, you can't just move the muktzeh out of the way because it's real muktzeh and you can't move muktzeh for any reason. But what happens if I don't directly move the muktzeh? I take a book, okay, whatever, something that's not muktzeh, a fork, a knife, okay, and I go into the freezer, and with the knife, I move away the frozen food. I move away the frozen food. So I'm indirectly moving muktzeh. Now, why am I moving the muktzeh? Not because I want the muktzeh. I'm moving the muktzeh because I want to get to the ice cream. So now I'm indirectly moving the muktzeh for the sake of something which is allowed. So then I would be allowed to do it. I can't just take the muktzeh directly with my hands, the fish or the meat frozen, and move it out of the way to get to the ice cream because I'm directly moving the muktzeh. But what happens if I move the muktzeh indirectly and I'm moving it not for the sake of the muktzeh, I'm moving it because I want to get to the ice cream in the back? So then you would be allowed to do it. Or, for instance, what happens, they give an example. There's straw, straw is Muktzeh on Shabbos, not a straw you drink from. Straw, hay, is Muktzeh on Shabbos. What happens, there's a bunch of fruit placed in the straw, okay? It's stored there, whatever. Now I want to get to the fruit. Now I can't move the straw away because the straw is muktzeh. But would I be allowed to move with a fork, move away the straw, and then take the fruit out of it? Or just stick the fork into the fruit, pull it out of the straw? Because again, I'm indirectly moving the straw because when I pull it out, the straw covers the apple. So when I take out the apple, I'm moving the straw, but I'm moving it indirectly. And why am I moving it? Not because I want to move the straw. I'm moving the straw because I want this thing which is non-muktzeh, then I would be allowed to do it. Or, okay, another thing, which is a very practical example. We're discussing about shells and peels of animals, of fruits and vegetables that are not edible are muktzeh. Okay? Therefore, we said, Dr. Rebbe said you shouldn't eat nuts if the shells are muktzeh because people come to play with it. What happens if I had an egg? Okay, I peeled the egg on the table. Or I did eat nuts. Now I have a bunch of pistachio shells, walnut shells, whatever, on the table. But it's on a napkin. It's on the napkin. Am I allowed to now pick up the napkin with the peels and shells in it to throw it out? Now, based on what we just said, you would be allowed to. Because I'm not picking up the peels with my hand, then I wouldn't be allowed to do unless it's what's called Ger Sharei. It's a big mess for Shabbos, then I could do it. But just as far as muktzeh goes, if I pick up the napkin that has all the nut shells in it, or the egg peels or whatever, I'm not directly moving the muktzeh. I am moving the muktzeh through a napkin, which is not muktzeh. And why am I moving the peels and the shells off the table? Not for the sake of the peels or shells, which are muktzeh. I'm moving it because I need the place at the table. So then it wouldn't be a problem either. I would be allowed to do it. Because again, I'm moving the muktzeh only because of something not muktzeh. But if I want to move it because I want to protect the muktzeh or whatever for the sake of the muktzeh, then you wouldn't be allowed to do it.
Rabbi, if you're stuck with a lot of some peels in your sink, but somehow you've got a lot of peels in the sink on Shabbos. So
why would you have peels in the sink on Shabbos?
because maybe before Shabbos you were peeling, because it's easier to do it that way. But
You
just
have to make sure before Shabbos to throw them out.
you can't move it. You can't move it.
Peels in this are completely, if they're not edible, they're completely muktzeh.
But-
Which means
yeah.
if you have peels that are not edible in your sink before Shabbos, they're completely muktzeh. The only heter would be what's called ger sharei because it's a mess, but that's not necessarily the case. So you have to make sure before Shabbos. One second. You have to make sure to check your sink before Shabbos and make sure there's no peels in there.
So if you have a bag in the sink or something on top, and then it was on top of that, the peels are on top of the bag or something.
Then if you're moving it with the bag.
Yeah.
So even though because you're indirectly moving the muktzeh, not for the muktzeh purpose, but for the non-muktzeh purpose, then you would be allowed to. Or let's say they give another example. Was the candy dish, a dish full of candy that you want to pass around, and somebody accidentally left some money in the dish. You have a big, candy display, whatever, and somebody left something really muktzeh in there. Now you want to pass around. You want people to take the candies. So again, how are you moving the muktzeh? Indirectly. You're not picking up the money. You're moving the tray of candy or the dish of candy. And now why are you moving it? Because people want to eat the candy. So even though there's muktzeh in the tray, but you're not moving the muktzeh directly. You wouldn't be allowed to take the money with your hand and take it out. That wouldn't be a problem at all. The same thing. What happens if non-muktzeh is on top of muktzeh? This question you have a lot of times, by the way. The people during the week have a talis and tefillin bag. And the tefillin are muktzeh on Shabbos, we learned. But they have the talis in there also. So what happens if it's laying on the table, let's say. I'm allowed to open the bag and pull out the talis, even though I might be indirectly moving the tefillin, whatever. But again, that's not an issue because I'm not moving the tefillin directly. I'm moving it through the bag, and I'm not doing it for the tefillin. I'm doing it for the talis, which is not muktzeh. So then you would be allowed to do it. Or again, if something is on top of something else, non-muktzeh is on top of muktzeh, no problem taking it off. But there's a few details over here that's an exception, and that is like this. What happens if a kid is holding a stone? Now, a rock is completely muktzeh on Shabbos. What happens if you have a kid that's holding a stone? Okay. You're not allowed to pick up, because it's a very interesting din. This is a little bit opposite of what we just learned, but this is the din in Gemara and Shulchan Aruch and so on. A kid is holding a rock. The rock is completely muktzeh. Am I allowed to pick up the kid? So halacha says you can't. The Gemara says you can't. Shulchan Aruch says you can't. Why? Because that's called directly picking up the stone. It's not indirect because the kid is holding the stone. By you picking up the kid, it's directly picking up the stone. That's what halacha says. Therefore, what do you have to do if a kid's holding a stone? He's walking in the street, let's say you'd be allowed to carry Yom Tov or whatever, Eid or whatever. You'd be allowed to carry. And now the kid picked up, he's walking home from shul or walking somewhere, and the kid picks up a nice rock, a nice stone, and the kid wants to be held. So the thing is, you can't hold him. You have to convince the kid to drop it. Because that's called in halacha, that picking up a kid that's holding a stone is called directly doing it. Unless, God forbid, you're in the middle of a street and the cars are coming, so then it's a whole different story. Now, what happens if the kid will get a panic attack or throw a tantrum? So then halacha says like this: if the kid throws a tantrum, he has a din of a sick person, and therefore you could be more makel with the din of muktzeh. Because for Chayla, the Chacham were lenient in their prohibitions. Okay, now, what happens though? If a kid's holding money, something valuable that's muktzeh. So then he's not allowed, you're not allowed to, not only are you not allowed to pick up the kid, according to halacha, you're not allowed to hold the kid's hand and walk with him. A kid is holding an expensive muktzeh item in his right hand, and you're going to take his left hand and walk with him in the street. According to many opinions, you're not allowed to do that. Why? Because if it's valuable, the kid might drop it, and then the parent's going to forget it's Shabbos because it's valuable, and he's going to pick it up and walk with it. So, and it's muktzeh. So then you wouldn't be allowed to even hold the kid's hand. If it's a stone, the kid's holding a rock, okay, it's not valuable. The kid dropped it, nobody's going to care. So then you're not allowed to pick up the kid to carry the kid, but you're allowed to hold his hand and walk with the other hand that doesn't have the muktzeh, and you're allowed to walk with the kid. That's not a problem at all. Now, the next thing is like this. Opening a drawer on Shabbos is a whole separate thing. We'll try to get into that maybe next time. Okay, let me just say a general concept over here. Something which is a base for muktzeh is muktzeh. Remember, at the beginning of muktzeh, we discussed why is there an old Jewish tradition of putting the halachos on the table before Shabbos begins. Because we discussed then that when, and this is a very important din in Muktzeh, by the way, which we will learn, but not today. Because the table is a base for the candles, which are completely Muktzeh. Non-lit candles are keli shemalach le'isr, that you would be allowed to move if you need the place. Candles that were lit on Shabbos, the candle holder is a base of the flame, which remains muktzeh because it was muktzeh when Shabbos began. It remains muktzeh for the duration of Shabbos. Therefore, the table is also a base of the flame, and therefore the table is completely muktzeh. What happens if I want to move the table after the candles are out? I wouldn't be allowed to, because the table becomes as muktzeh as the object on it. So what do I do if I want to move the table out in the morning? So the din is, if something becomes a base for muktzeh and non-muktzeh, and the non-muktzeh at present is more valuable to you than the muktzeh, even though it's much cheaper, but right now this is more valuable for you than the expensive muktzeh, then it becomes a base for muktzeh and non-muktzeh. Under certain conditions, it could be moved. That's why the minig is you put challah on the table when you bench shlich, because then when Shabbos began, the table was a base for the flame, which is completely muktzeh, but it also is a base for the challah. And on Shabbos, the challah is more valuable to you than the flame. Even though the silver candle holder could cost $5,000, and the way it's going now, halachos will soon also cost $5,000 a challah. But meanwhile, it's $10 a challah. I don't know what it costs anymore. $10 a challah, okay. So even though the challah is $10 a challah and the candle holder maybe $5,000, but the bottom line is, right now, the challah is more valuable than the flame. So then it becomes a base of muktzeh, not muktzeh. But what happens? Let's get back to this dinner. This is all when I'm using my hands to move muktzeh indirectly. Right? That was the din we're discussing now. Until now, we're discussing I'm moving muktzeh with my hand, but indirectly, with a stick, with a napkin, with whatever. What happens if I move muktzeh not with my hands? I move muktzeh with my elbow, with my foot. Can I kick muktzeh on Shabbos? So generally speaking, the Alter Rebbe happens to be pretty lenient about all these dinim. And the Alter Rebbe says like this: you can move muktzeh with your foot. The Alter Rebbe holds also you can blow muktzeh. Many poskim disagree. The Alter Rebbe holds that you can blow muktzeh. Because you have a muktzeh object on the table, and it's not that heavy, and you're allowed to blow it. You're allowed to blow it off the table if you need. Or you can move it with your elbow, you can move it with your foot. The Alter Rebbe holds, though, if it's real muktzeh, it's better not to move it indirectly unless if it's a loss of money, if you can avoid it. But in other words, like this, you can kick the muktzeh, you can blow it according to the Alter Rebbe, you can blow on it. Okay, the Arpa is going to make machma with the moving of the body, but the Alter Rebbe is lenient. There's no reason why we can't be lenient. We follow the Alter Rebbe. So basically, what happens if you find somebody left money out on the floor, and you don't want the money out there in the floor? So then you're allowed to kick it away. You're allowed to move it away. You can blow it away. You can move it with your elbow. Okay, touching muktzeh. Again, touching muktzeh is also not forbidden. The only time you're not allowed to touch muktzeh is something that by touching it, it's going to move. For instance, an egg that was laid on Shabbos or Yom Tov is muktzeh. And an egg, because it's round, if I touch it, it's going to move. So then I can't touch it because inevitably it's going to move. But if it's not going to move, then I'm allowed to touch muktzeh. Or let's say they give another example: a lamp is hanging from the ceiling, and it moves very easily. And if I touch it with the finger, it's going to move. But Moshe, we discussed animals are muktzeh and Shabbos, but I'm allowed to pet an animal. I'm not moving it. I can't pick it up, but I can touch it. I can pet it because touching muktzeh is not prohibited, and therefore that would be allowed to do on Shabbos. Unless if the thing is going to move, and then it's going to be an issue. Okay, let's go to Tanya.